pray with me? Lord, may the words of my mouth, our meditative thoughts, and every movement of our hearts be always pure and pleasing before your eyes, our protector and redeemer, Lord. Amen. You may be seated. A shepherd feeds his sheep. The miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 is actually the only miracle besides the resurrection, which is found in every single gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's kind of unique, and I was surprised to discover this in studying and preparing for today. It has rich references to Old Testament stories. This amazing multiplication of food is reminiscent of the miracle of God supplying manna in the wilderness in Moses' generation, as well as Old Testament prophets of Elijah and Elisha, who fed people miraculously. Now, they fed about 100 people, and they had like 20 loaves or something like that. So there are the similarities, but there are some significant differences too. But first, let's talk about the context of this story. This is found on page 841, by the way, in your blue Bibles. The apostles returned to Jesus, and they had told him all that they had done and taught. See, they had gone out and were teaching and casting out demons and healing people, and they acted as extensions of Jesus' own ministry, and they've seen great success. So he knew they needed a break, and he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." This was because there were so many goings and comings that they had no leisure even to eat. He had sent them out 2 by 2. They were healing. They were casting out demons. They were proclaiming the gospel, and they had enjoyed so much success that they didn't even get a chance to eat. Where is a burger joint in the Palestinian countryside when you need it? Then verse 32, they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now, of course, the disciples said yes to Jesus, who wanted to debrief them, to give them encouragement and fill them up with strength and courage to keep up this ministry. Now, it wasn't like Jesus was offering them a cruise or anything, but they had seen and experienced much and must have had many questions. And as one in pastoral ministry, this is the verse that I can most relate to. Come away with me and rest a while. I imagine many of you could use a rest, far from the responsibilities and the worries of life. But the crowd had other ideas in mind. When they saw Jesus and the disciples, they seized their opportunity. See, when you are Jesus and you have this reputation of healing and deliverance, people are going to run out of their way to be able to be near to you. Celebrity culture hasn't changed much. By the time Jesus and his disciples got to shore, there was already a great crowd. Now, that break that the disciples were so looking forward to was not happening at this time. All I can do is hope that they had a bit of reserve from which to draw on, because they were going to need it. But Jesus sees this crowd. They were hungry and they were expectant, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So naturally, he does what a shepherd would do. He teaches them many things. See, sheep need shepherds. Now, it seems like an obvious thing for me to say about a domesticated animal, that this animal needs care, needs oversight, knowledge and wisdom from a human being to care for its needs. The beauty and the fruitfulness of life depends a lot upon the character and the competencies of the shepherd. If the shepherd is gentle and kind, intelligent, brave, and selfless in their devotion to the flock, then life is good. But some shepherds are not those things. Some shepherds are careless, neglectful, and uninterested in the struggles of their sheep. The flourishing and contentedness of beloved sheep sharply contrasts with the hardship and suffering under a neglectful shepherd. See, shepherds matter, and Moses, who was also a shepherd, knew this when he found out that he was not going to be the one to cross into the promised land. So he pleaded with God, please don't let the people be sheep without a shepherd. He says this in Numbers 27. And God heard his prayer, and he gifted the people with Joshua. So Moses was disappointed, no doubt, that it was not going to be him, but he could relax because he knew that God had provided another leader. David, the author of the famous and popular Psalm 23, himself a shepherd, was known as a shepherd king. And he penned these words, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Shepherd leaders, Moses, David, Jesus. Verse 35, and when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. So as a good shepherd, Jesus, why don't you send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages, because we don't have enough to care for them." See, the disciples were already tired, and they wanted a break, and they had made it already to the late afternoon, when it seemed prudent to remind Jesus that maybe these folks are hungry. Verse 37, Jesus answered, "You give them something to eat." See, the disciples were new at being shepherds, and Jesus had other ideas in mind. Earlier in their itinerant ministry, they had lived off the generosity of others, the hospitality of the people they went to. But here, Jesus insists that they are the ones to return the service with provisions that they don't even have. So the disciples said to Jesus, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" I mean, it's really almost a ridiculous statement, but we should not assume that they are being disrespectful to Jesus. The amount of money is equal to between 7 and 8 months of one person who is working, which even if you pooled that together among the 12, that's 3 weeks worth. So Jesus directs them and go. Make an assessment of your resources. How many loaves do you have? Go find out. Now, when the disciples did this assessment of their resources, they discovered a paltry sum. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. See, fish and bread were central to a typical Palestinian diet. Meat was rarely available except at feasts. The Galilean countryside was full of villages which would have had bread, but they were far away from the villages. But even if there were one village close by, it would have had a hard time feeding a crowd that size. A typical village had about 3,000 inhabitants. That's a lot of baking, and that's a lot of time. And you women think, oh yeah, who would have to be doing all this baking? But Jesus was trying to direct them to say, check all of your resources, guys. Think about it. All of your resources. And anyways, Mark often depicts the disciples as dense and slow to understand. And this is one such instance because they neglected to fully ascertain all of their available resources. Jesus himself. So Jesus is gracious. He commands them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, this detail of the green grass tells us this happened in the springtime, probably close to the Passover. At other times, the grass would be dry and certainly not green. And whether it was soft and lush or sort of scratchy and hard, which is what I kind of guess, green is the color of abundance, newness, and of course, water. And of course, it is the best color, really. And even Shepherd David knew this. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. Jesus, the shepherd, has seen people in want and expectation, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. These folks who were gathered to listen to Jesus were organized in ranks like armies. The purpose seems to be for the help of the distribution of the food. But funny, it sounds like Jesus was organizing them in groups of fighting men. Perhaps we were meant to recall Israel from the time of the Exodus. And those who were wandering around in the wilderness was actually the all of Israel, and so they would have been men and women. So let's talk about this 5,000. Matthew's gospel made it clear that women and children were in the crowd. So why do we only get the counting of the men here in the Gospel of Mark? Now, the simple answer is you estimate the heads of the households, the men, knowing that the rest of the people hearing the story would fill in the details for themselves. But what if we also recognize that this is the second of Mark's references to the number for a legion? See, a legion is 5,000 men. And Mark uses legion terminology when Jesus kicks out a legion of demons from a man who was hiding in the tombs. So this has Roman resistance overtones, which the first hearers would be encouraged by. So here we have 5,000, or a legion, of male followers that Jesus provides for in a wilderness setting. Rebel movements were known for gathering in the desert during this time. And every army needs bread and provisions. What you need to know is that oppressed people use stories or hidden transcripts, sort of like our current day sub-tweets on Twitter, for the purpose of passing on this encouragement to those who are being ruled over. The stories can't be obvious or they might get arrested. So hence they are hidden transcripts. This may or may not be in the mind of Mark as he passed on the number 5,000 to his first hearers who experienced Roman oppression every single day. But this message is abundantly clear, and I want to make it clear for us. Jesus is feeding a spiritual army, not a military company. So verse 41, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. Because this is what a shepherd does for his sheep. Jesus does what you would always do before a meal, to give thanks for the bread and then divide it up to be sustenance for those who are around you. The shepherd prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. So they all ate and were satisfied. And because the bread and the fish were enough, as regular people, received the bread, broke it, and then passed it on, the basket was replenished. Now, I'm not saying that everyone took out their own lunch and decided to share it with others. That might have happened earlier in the day, but not this time. Nor should we picture the disciples doing all the running around and personally feeding 15,000 individuals. That would take many hours, days even, if the disciples are seen somehow as waiters. No, it had to be that Jesus passed the food to the disciples, and then they passed it to the first person, and that each time as it was passed on or given away to the next person, the basket was filled again. These were normal, everyday people being caught up in the miracle that occurred as they took the bread and the fish and they gave it away to the person sitting next to them. See, this was bread for the life of the world. In anticipation of our feast, we will have one day with the great shepherd of the souls, and of which we remember every time we gather at this table. A feast prepared beside the still waters, prepared for the restoring of our souls. The crowd sitting on the green hill that day, whose bellies were filled with food and whose hearts were filled with the teaching of the shepherd, would remember that day. And they would know that the rod of protection and the staff of discipline would cause such goodness and mercy to follow them all the days of their life. When we trust Jesus as the shepherd, we trust his care, his oversight, knowledge, and wisdom to know our human needs. And we are given a life of beauty and fruitfulness because of the character and competencies of the shepherd. Because the shepherd has prepared a dwelling in his house where peace and righteousness reign supreme, they knew that they could trust this shepherd. May you know this deeper trust of the shepherd today. Amen.